Alright, so this is going to be French Rev Part 2, where we're going to focus on Napoleon. So, French Rev has ended, and there is a new power in place called the Directory. Essentially, it is 5 executive people that are in power, so it's kind of like having 5 presidents, and it's not very effective. So, basically what's happening is the Directory is having to rely on the military to remain in power and keep order. The person in charge of the military is Napoleon. So what Napoleon does is he stages a coup. A coup is where a person overthrows the government, and essentially that is what Napoleon did. Is he overthrew the government and then named himself the leader of France. This is not very democratic. Basically, he used his military power and used the military to overthrow everybody and get them out of power. So the people that were left there voted to dissolve or do away with the Directory, and set up a group of 3 consuls, naming Napoleon the first consul, meaning he had the most power. In France, you're going to have some wars that are going on. Those are going to end. Everybody hated France at this time because France was trying to take everything over. The main country that had the most issues with France was Great Britain. So you're going to see that time and time again. Alright, so Napoleon is going to take over in France, and there's going to be lots that he's going to do. I'm going to talk about most of it. Not all of it's in your notes. Some of the first thing that he does is creates a Napoleonic code. You have tax code. Just erase tax and put Napoleonic code. The Napoleonic code protected the rights granted during the French Revolution. So the people were afraid that now with Napoleon in power that their rights were going to be stripped away from them and there was going to be kind of like a dictator in power. Well, by putting the Napoleonic Code in place, it guaranteed those people the freedoms that they had fought for during the French Revolution, giving Napoleon even more support from the people. The next thing that he does is you got tariffs and infrastructure. Let's go over tariffs first. So tariffs are taxes on imported goods. So what happens is your country puts a tax on other companies from other countries. So what that means is take for example, there's an article right here regarding Trump wanting to impose tariffs on China. We have a lot of Chinese products here in America that are sold and very cheaply. If we increase tariffs on China, those products are now sold at a higher price, meaning the American-made companies that make the same or similar products, people are going to be more enticed to buy the American or domestic-made products. So this isn't a new concept that Trump was wanting to do. It has been done throughout history. We're going to talk about it again in American history at the end of the 1800s. So tariffs were put in place to protect French industries from foreign competition. So companies in France that are making the same product that companies outside of France are making are going to be protected because their prices are going to be either the same or a little bit cheaper, and people are going to be inclined to buy the domestic made goods, the goods made in their country. So that's tariffs. The next is infrastructure. Infrastructure is the is how your cities and how your country is put together, basically. So there's a system of roads, canals, bridges. Nowadays we have highways and interstates. That came about in the 50s after Eisenhower was president. But the infrastructure in France was outdated. The bridges were falling apart. The canals were not well kept. The roads weren't well kept. So basically what Napoleon does is he improves the infrastructure, which improves travel throughout the country. Many of the bridges and canals and railroads and things like that are still around today. Alright, so that's some of the main things that he did while he was in power. And some of the first things that happened. Now, there are some things that aren't in your notes that you should be aware of. The Haitian Revolution, Napoleon, France was in charge of Haiti. Haiti was a French colony, and the Haitians start to revolt after the French Revolution. So if the French people are able to gain independence, then why shouldn't Haiti, who was a colony of France? So the Haitians revolt. Toussaint Louverture was the leader of that revolution in Haiti, which is normally something we talk about, but with Corona going on, we're not going to be able to get to it this year. So the Haitians revolt, gain independence, and then the other thing that happens is Napoleon needs money to help fund some of his wars and his projects that are going on. He's trying to conquer most of Europe, and he needs money. Now, Napoleon originally wanted to conquer essentially the world. However, he forgot mostly about the Western Hemisphere and wanted to stick mainly to Europe and the Eastern Hemisphere. So, to help fund his conquests, he sells the Louisiana Territory to the United States of America, and that was in 1803. That is something that we will look at after Christmas break. So, France is going to start to create a empire, and things were running really well. Napoleon was in power, things were running great, and eventually things happen that kind of start spiraling downward for Napoleon. And it all has to deal with his hatred of Great Britain. So what he tries to do is he tries to create a continental system. So if you guys take a look at this here, you're going to see that I have the Iberian Peninsula marked. That's for in a little bit. But Europe is basically this area right here. So this is all Europe. The United Kingdom is not part of continental Europe. So what Napoleon proposes to the rest of Europe is to create a system in which these countries rely on each other and kind of forget about the United Kingdom. In essence, that's going to screw over the UK, and they're going to lose out on a lot of trade partners. So this would hurt Great Britain. The problem with this is his blockades that he was going to create. So he was going to set up blockades at the major trade ports. Now, you don't have to do it everywhere, but in the major trade ports is he would have to set up a blockade. Problem is, the blockade wasn't tight enough. The British Navy was much stronger than the French Navy, and this wouldn't work. And we get another problem as a result of this. The United States was one of the French's best trade partners because of the French helping out the United States during the Revolutionary War just a couple decades prior. So the British had actually set up their own blockade, and they stopped American ships that were heading to France. They searched them, and then they taxed them. Well, this actually led to the War of 1812. So Napoleon's continental system actually started the War of 1812 between America and Great Britain. Some people call this the Second War for Independence. Didn't last very long. The United States, of course, ended up winning that one. Napoleon's second big mistake was called the Peninsular War. So very similar situation coming off of the continental system. Portugal, which is right here, this is the Iberian Peninsula, right here. You got Spain and Portugal. France is right here. Portugal is continuing to trade with the United Kingdom. Napoleon, who's in France, is upset with that. So what he's going to do is he's going to send troops through Spain into Portugal to get them to stop trading with the United Kingdom. Spain already hates France because Napoleon put his brother Joseph in charge there. So Spain gets this nationalistic feel during this time, and they actually declare war on France. So his plan kind of backfires there. It doesn't work out for him. So his third mistake, and his most costly, was the invasion of Russia, and it all deals from the continental system. Here's Moscow. This is Russia up here. Many of these countries weren't around at that time. So what happened is Alexander I, who is, we've talked about Tsar Nicholas II. Alexander the First is his relative. It's either, I believe it's his great-grandpa that we talked about during the Russian Revolution. So Alexander the First is continuing to trade grain to the United Kingdom, very similar to what happened in Portugal. France is upset, and France actually controls much of the land in this area. Now, Russia and France both wanted this area right here, that where present-day Poland is located. So what's going to happen is France is going to march this way, and France is going to invade Russia. Big mistake, don't do that. So, Russia's response, Alexander the First doesn't fight him. So imagine you have an army on this side, on the western and southern border of Russia, and you don't fight France. You just march back toward Moscow. And as the Russian troops are marching back toward Moscow, they burn all the crops and they kill all the livestock. What that does is that does not allow France, the French troops, to have anything to eat, and eventually they're going to freeze because we're coming upon the winter months. So, Napoleon's going to attack Moscow. Alexander the First continues doing what he's been doing, and he burns it to the ground. So, winter is hitting, and there's no shelter for the French troops. So France has to head back home. The troops are tired, they're freezing, they're starving, so Russia decides to attack them. This right here explains the size of the French troops. When they left, there was 422,000 troops. When they got to Moscow, there was only 100,000 troops. So some had died in battle, some had froze to death, and some had starved to death. So they get to Moscow, they realize they're going to try to cut their losses, and then they're going to head back to France. By the time they get back to France, there's only about 10,000 troops in the French army. And you guys can look at some of these dates here. So this was October 18th. All right? And then over here, you can look at the temperature on their way back. So today is December 11th. Let's go really close to that. Let's take December 6th. That's actually my birthday. It was negative 38 degrees, and that is in Celsius. This is well below. It's like negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's about 60 degrees Fahrenheit below freezing. That's pretty darn cold. Alright, so these troops are freezing their butts off. They don't have a lot of food. They're tired. They've been marching for months. And you can see here, the Soviet troops are basically using guerrilla warfare tactics to take down the French troops. So what happens is Napoleon gets back to France, and the people had had enough with his conquests and his failures, so they exile him to Elba. He actually gets exiled twice. The first time is to Elba, the second time is to St. Helena. Now, after he gets exiled to Elba, he escapes, goes back to France for about 3 months. It's called the 100 Days. The ruler that was in power there was actually King Louis XVIII. Was very unpopular, and there was rumors that he was going to undo a lot of the stuff during the revolution. So Napoleon actually goes over and goes back into France, raises an army, overthrows the king, and guess what he does? He goes to try to fight Great Britain again. So he does, and at the Battle of Waterloo, he loses, and then the French people have had enough, and they exile him to St. Helena. He is there for about 7 years until he dies. If you are wondering about France's government now, it is very similar to the United States. They have a bicameral legislature, just meaning they have 2 houses, very similar to us. They have a president, very similar to us. They have a cabinet, which is appointed by the president, which is very similar to us. All right? If you have any questions, be sure to contact me. Make sure you use this to get your notes done, and you need to have your questions done as well. Thank you very much.